Close your eyes for a moment and try to answer a question that sounds absurd until you actually attempt it. How do you know right now that you are awake? Not that you feel awake. Not that the world around you seems solid and continuous and stitched together by cause and effect, but that you know it with the kind of certainty you'd stake your life on. Chances are, when you actually sit with the question, the confidence starts to wobble. You remember dreams that felt every bit as real as this moment does. You remember waking from one dream into what turned out to be another. And somewhere in that memory is a small, cold thread of doubt that has been pulling at human beings for as long as we've been capable of asking questions at all. This is not a new anxiety dressed up in new language. It is one of the oldest problems in philosophy, and it has never been solved, not really, not in the way that would let you close the book and stop thinking about it. It has only been reframed generation after generation in the vocabulary available to each age. A cave and its shadows, a dreaming mind and a deceiving demon, a brain suspended in a vat wired to a machine. A civilization so advanced it can simulate its own ancestors. Each version says something slightly different, but underneath the costumes, they are all asking the same question: what if the reality you're standing in right now is not the reality that's actually there? This is a strange thing to sit with because your senses are the only tools you have ever used to investigate the world, and now you're being asked to investigate the tools themselves, using nothing but the tools. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. You can't step outside your own perception to check whether your perception is accurate because every attempt to check uses the very faculties you're trying to verify. This is the trap, and it has caught some of the sharpest minds in history, not because they were confused, but because the trap is built into the architecture of being a conscious thing that experiences a world instead of simply being told about one. So let's walk into it together. Not to escape with a tidy answer, because there isn't one waiting at the end of this, but to understand exactly why the question is so hard to shake, why it keeps returning in new forms every time we think we've outgrown it, and what it might mean to live well even while the ground beneath your certainty stays permanently a little soft. We begin in a cave because that's where the Western tradition of this question effectively begins, with a philosopher named Plato writing in the 4th century BCE, putting words into the mouth of his teacher Socrates and asking his readers to imagine something that must have sounded, at the time, like a kind of horror story. Picture a group of prisoners. They have been chained inside a cave since childhood, chained in such a way that they cannot turn their heads. All they can see is the wall in front of them. Behind them, out of sight, is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners' backs is a raised walkway where other people walk back and forth carrying objects, statues, carved figures of animals and people and tools, holding them up so that the firelight throws their shadows onto the wall the prisoners are staring at. The prisoners hear voices too, echoing off the stone, and because they've never known anything else, they assume the shadows are the voices' source. They assume the flickering shapes on the wall are the whole of reality, not representations of things, the things themselves. Think about what that means for a prisoner's inner life. If shadows are all you've ever seen, you don't experience them as shadows. You experience them as objects, as the full and complete furniture of the world. You'd develop a whole vocabulary around them. You'd get skilled at predicting which shadow follows which, at naming them, maybe even competing with your fellow prisoners over who can guess the next shape fastest. And Plato notes that this skill, this shadow prediction expertise, would be treated as wisdom by the people trapped there. It would be the highest achievement available inside that cave. And the terrifying part is that none of the prisoners would feel imprisoned, because a life spent watching shadows and getting good at naming them feels, from the inside, like a life spent understanding the world. There's no ache of absence because you don't know there's anything to miss. Now Plato asks us to imagine that one prisoner is freed, unchained, forced to stand, forced to turn around. And the first thing that happens is not enlightenment. It's pain. The fire itself, which the prisoner has never directly seen, is blinding after a lifetime of dim, second-hand light. The objects being carried past, the actual carved figures rather than their shadows, are disorienting because they don't move the way the shadows moved. They don't behave the way a lifetime of shadow logic has taught the prisoner to expect. Plato is explicit about this. The freed prisoner's first instinct is to want to turn back around, back to the wall, back to the shadows, because the shadows, however limited, at least made sense. The truth in this telling is not something you slide into gently. It's something that hurts before it helps, and the pain is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're doing something real. But suppose the prisoner is dragged further, out of the cave entirely, up a steep and rugged path, out into open sunlight. Plato describes this ascent as difficult, almost violent. Someone has to drag the prisoner rather than the prisoner choosing to go. And once outside, the pain intensifies before it resolves. The sun is unbearable at first. The prisoner can only look at shadows and reflections in water, indirect evidence of a world too bright to face directly. Slowly, gradually, the eyes adjust. First the prisoner can look at the moon and stars, then eventually, after real time has passed, at the sun itself, and understand it not as one object among others but as the source that makes all the seeing possible in the first place, the thing that gives light to everything else and even governs the seasons and the years. In Plato's philosophy, this sun stands in for what he calls the form of the good, the ultimate source of truth and value that everything else in the intelligible world depends on, in the same way every visible thing in the cave depended on that fire. Here's the part of the allegory that tends to get skipped over in casual retellings, but it's arguably the most important part for anyone who has ever tried to explain something true to people who don't want to hear it. Plato has the freed prisoner go back down into the cave. Back into the darkness, which after time in the sunlight is now disorienting in the opposite direction. The prisoner's eyes need time to readjust to the dimness, and in that transitional blindness, the returning prisoner performs worse at the shadow games than the people who never left. Fumbles the predictions. Gets the names wrong. And Plato says the other prisoners watching this happen would conclude that the journey upward ruined the returning prisoner, that leaving the cave damages you, that anyone who tries to unchain the rest of them and drag them toward the light should be resisted, even killed, if they get the chance. This is not a throwaway detail. It is Plato's own commentary, thinly veiled, on what happened to his teacher Socrates, who was executed by the city of Athens for the crime of asking too many uncomfortable questions, for making people uncertain about things they had assumed were settled. The allegory of the cave isn't just an abstract metaphor about epistemology. It's also a story about what happens, socially and politically, to anyone who tries to tell a comfortable, functioning group of people that the reality they've built their lives around is thinner than they think. The knowledge doesn't arrive as a gift they're grateful for. It arrives as an insult to the world they've already made peace with. There's a detail in the allegory that's easy to rush past, and it changes how the whole story should be read. Plato specifies that the prisoners have been chained since childhood, not captured as adults who might still remember a freer state to feel nostalgic for. There is no before for them. Their entire sense of what counts as normal, as complete, as simply how things are, was formed inside the constraint itself. This is a colder and more realistic picture of how limitation actually works on a mind than the alternative, where someone is snatched from freedom and knows exactly what's being taken. Real limitation, the kind that's hardest to notice, rarely announces itself. It arrives early, before there's a self there yet to object, and by the time that self exists, the limitation has already been folded into its idea of what existing even means. A child grows up inside a particular set of assumptions about what's normal to want, what's realistic to expect, what kind of life is available to someone like them, and those assumptions get absorbed the same way the prisoners absorbed the shadows, not as one option among many but as the basic shape of reality itself. Years later, something cracks that shape open: a book, a person, a failure, a success that wasn't supposed to be possible, and the cracking hurts in exactly the way Plato describes the sunlight hurting, not because anything bad is happening, but because a structure mistaken for the floor turns out to have been a ceiling all along. And this is where the cave stops being an ancient curiosity and starts being uncomfortably current. Because notice what the shadows actually are structurally. They are not lies exactly. They are real effects caused by real objects, filtered through a real process: the fire, the walkway, the angle of the light that determines what the prisoners get to see and how. The prisoners are not being fed nothing. They are being fed something, but something several steps removed from the source, shaped by a mechanism they can't see and didn't choose. Now think about the information you consume in an average day. A headline curated by an algorithm you didn't design, trained on data you never agreed to, optimized not for truth but for the amount of time it can hold your attention. An image filtered, cropped, selected from 1,000 other images that told a less flattering story. A political narrative repeated so often by so many separate voices that it starts to feel like independent confirmation, when in fact it might be a single source echoing through 1,000 mouths. You are, in a very real sense, watching shadows on a wall, cast by a fire you don't control, carried by hands you'll never see. And like Plato's prisoners, you've gotten good at it. You can predict what shape comes next. You call that skill being informed. The allegory isn't asking you to believe you're literally chained in a stone cavern. It's asking a sharper question: how would you know if you were experiencing something similarly mediated, similarly partial, and mistaking the shadow for the whole? Notice too that Plato never actually tells us the freed prisoner reaches some final, unmediated truth either. Even at the peak of the ascent, staring at the sun, the prisoner is still a creature with eyes, still bound by the structure of vision itself, still perceiving the source of light rather than somehow becoming identical with it. The cave allegory doesn't promise an escape from mediation altogether. It promises only that some vantage points are less mediated than others, that ascent is possible even if a perfectly unfiltered view might not be. That's a strange kind of comfort, if you can call it comfort at all. It suggests the goal was never to reach some view from nowhere. It was simply to keep climbing. 2,000 years later, a different thinker sat alone in a room, deliberately trying to construct his own version of that cave from the inside, using nothing but his mind and a willingness to doubt everything he could possibly doubt. His name was René Descartes, and in 1641 he published a short work called Meditations on First Philosophy, which opens with one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the history of thought. He says that he had, from an early age, accepted many false opinions as true, and that everything he had built on top of those opinions was therefore doubtful, and so, once in his life, he needed to demolish everything completely and start again from the foundations if he wanted to establish anything firm and lasting in the sciences. That's the project. Total demolition. Not skepticism as a pose, not doubt as a rhetorical trick, but an actual, sustained attempt to find out what, if anything, survives when you refuse to take anything for granted. Descartes doesn't do this because he wants to end up a skeptic. He does it because he wants the opposite. He wants certainty so bedrock that no future doubt could ever shake it again, and the only way to test whether a foundation is truly solid is to try, as hard as you can, to knock it down. He starts with the senses because that's where most of what we call knowledge originally comes from. But he notices something simple and troubling: his senses have deceived him before. Things look different up close than far away. A stick half submerged in water appears bent even though it's straight. If a source has lied to you even once, Descartes reasons, it's not wise to trust it completely ever again. This alone doesn't get him very far, though, because most sensory errors happen at the margins, in unusual conditions, distance, dim light, and it seems absurd to doubt that he's sitting by the fire in his dressing gown, holding this very paper in his hands. Surely that much is beyond doubt. And this is where Descartes introduces the argument that would echo for centuries and eventually mutate into brains in vats and simulated universes. He points out that he has, on other occasions, dreamed that he was sitting by exactly this kind of fire, in exactly this kind of dressing gown, holding paper in his hands, when in fact he was undressed and lying in bed. He describes reflecting on this and finding no certain markers by which waking experience can be distinguished from dreaming, and being genuinely astonished by that realization, so astonished it almost persuades him that he's asleep at that very moment. Sit with how strange this is. This is not someone remembering a vivid dream and being briefly rattled. This is a serious philosopher building his entire epistemological project around the observation that, in the moment itself, dreaming feels exactly as convincing as waking. There is no internal alarm, no asterisk attached to dream experience that marks it as unreal while it's happening. The conviction of reality you feel right now, reading these words, is qualitatively the same kind of conviction you felt inside dreams that later turned out to be nothing. If that's true, then the question of whether you're currently dreaming isn't something you can settle by paying closer attention, by looking harder at your hands or pinching your arm, because inside a sufficiently convincing dream, your hands look fine and pinching hurts. Descartes concludes that even the dream hypothesis doesn't destroy everything, though, because dreams are built from something. Even fantastical dream images, centaurs, sirens, impossible creatures, are assembled out of simpler components, colors, shapes, extension, and those basic building blocks seem to belong to a more general, more abstract kind of truth that would hold whether he was awake or dreaming. Mathematics, for instance. Whether he's awake or asleep, Descartes notes, 2 plus 3 still makes 5, and a square still has no more than 4 sides. But then, and this is the move that turns the whole meditation from unsettling into genuinely vertiginous, Descartes goes one step further than the dream argument alone requires. He asks what if there's a being, not God because God is supposed to be good and wouldn't deceive him, but some other power of the highest ability and cunning who has directed all its energies toward deceiving him completely. What if this evil genius has made it so that there is no earth, no sky, no extended body, no shape, no size, no place, and yet has ensured that all these things appear to Descartes exactly as they do now? In this scenario, even mathematics isn't safe, because a sufficiently powerful deceiver could make 2 plus 3 feel like 5 while it's actually something else, could corrupt the very faculties Descartes would use to check the math. This is the most totalizing doubt available to a human mind. It doesn't just ask whether your senses are reliable. It asks whether your reasoning itself, the tool you'd use to evaluate any evidence at all, might be compromised at the root. You'd think a doubt this complete would leave nothing standing. And for a moment in the text it doesn't. Descartes describes feeling as though he's fallen suddenly into a deep whirlpool, tumbled around so that he can neither touch bottom nor swim to the surface. This isn't academic detachment. He's describing something closer to a panic attack, the specific vertigo of having systematically removed every foothold you thought you had. And then comes the famous turn, the one piece of Descartes that even people who have never read a word of philosophy tend to know secondhand. He realizes that even if this evil genius is deceiving him about literally everything else, about the earth, the sky, his own body, the deceiver cannot make it false that Descartes is being deceived, because to be deceived, there has to be someone there to deceive. The doubting itself requires a doubter. He writes that this proposition, that he exists, is necessarily true every time he states it or conceives it in his mind. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It's worth being precise about what this actually proves, because it's often misunderstood as proving far more than it does. It doesn't prove that Descartes has a body. It doesn't prove that the room around him is real, or that other people exist, or that the past he remembers actually happened. All it proves is that there is a thinking thing happening right now in the act of doubting. That's the entire narrow foundation. Everything else, the whole external world, has to be rebuilt from that single point, and Descartes spends the rest of the meditations trying, controversially, to rebuild it, using an argument for the existence of a non-deceiving God to guarantee that his clear and distinct perceptions can be trusted. Most philosophers since have found that later reconstruction much shakier than the demolition that preceded it. But the demolition itself has never really been answered. The observation that dreaming and waking feel identical from the inside, and that the very faculties you'd use to investigate your situation might themselves be compromised, is still sitting there 380 years later unresolved. It's worth pausing on why Descartes chose to introduce a deceiving demon at all, rather than simply stopping at the dream argument. The dream argument, on its own, is unsettling but still leaves a door open because dreams, however convincing, are still assembled out of materials drawn from waking life, and there's a case to be made that even a dream world has to borrow its basic ingredients, color, shape, extension, from somewhere real. The demon closes that door. A being of sufficient power isn't limited to rearranging materials borrowed from a real world Descartes has already encountered. It could, in principle, fabricate the materials themselves, corrupt the very faculty of reasoning Descartes would use to check his math, make false things feel self-evidently true in exactly the way genuine self-evident truths feel. This is why the demon represents the most extreme form the doubt can take, a doubt that doesn't just question specific beliefs but questions the reliability of the checking process itself. And it's worth noting that Descartes doesn't actually believe such a demon exists. He's explicit that this is a deliberate exercise, a temporary and voluntary act of doubt undertaken for a single stated purpose to find out whether anything at all can resist it. The demon is a tool, not a theology. But the tool works precisely because it's constructed to be immune to every objection you might raise against it, since raising an objection requires using the same faculties the demon is hypothesized to control. What Descartes gives us, essentially, is the philosophical DNA for every reality doubt that follows. Strip away the 17th century costume of demons and dressing gowns, and what's left is a structural question. Is there any experience you could have, any test you could run, any evidence you could gather that would definitively distinguish a real external world from a perfect simulation of one generated entirely within your own mind or by some outside force? And the honest answer, the one Descartes essentially arrives at and never quite escapes, is no. Not from the inside. Every test uses instruments that could themselves be part of the deception. 3 centuries after Descartes, philosophers found a new vocabulary for the same trap, one drawn not from religion and demons but from science and technology, and it's the version most people encounter first because it's the version that shows up in thought experiments, philosophy classrooms, and eventually science fiction. It's called the brain in a vat. Here's the setup. Imagine a mad scientist, or if you prefer a less cartoonish version, simply an advanced neuroscience laboratory that removes a brain from a body and keeps it alive in a vat of nutrient fluid. The brain's neurons are connected to a supercomputer, which sends electrical signals precisely identical, in every relevant respect to the signals the brain would have received if it were still inside a skull, still connected to eyes and ears and skin, still walking around in a world. From the brain's perspective, there is no discontinuity. It experiences waking up, tasting coffee, feeling sunlight, having conversations, falling in love, none of it distinguishable in any way from what a normal embodied life would feel like, because the signals arriving at the neurons are, by the terms of the thought experiment, functionally indistinguishable from the real thing. The philosopher most associated with rigorously analyzing this scenario is Hilary Putnam, who took it up in his 1981 book Reason, Truth and History, though not, interestingly, to argue that we might actually be brains in vats. Putnam's real target was subtler and in some ways more interesting. He wanted to ask whether the very sentence "I am a brain in a vat" could be meaningfully true or false at all, and he argued through a chain of reasoning about how language and reference actually work, that a brain that had always been in a vat, that had never had any causal contact with real trees or real vats, couldn't successfully use the word vat to refer to actual vats because, on Putnam's view, words get their meaning through a real, causal connection to the things they refer to, not just through internal mental content. If your entire experience had been fed to you by a simulation and you'd never had contact with the actual world, your internal word tree wouldn't refer to real trees, it would refer to whatever pattern of electrical stimulation the simulation was feeding you when it made you think of trees. And so, Putnam argued, if you really were a lifelong brain in a vat, the sentence "I'm a brain in a vat" would actually come out false when you said it, because your words wouldn't be hooked up to the real reference needed to make the statement true. It's a clever technical argument, and it's had a complicated reception, but notice what it actually does and doesn't accomplish. It's a defense against one very specific version of the scenario. It doesn't touch the broader, more visceral worry that most people actually have when they encounter this thought experiment, which isn't really a puzzle about linguistic reference. It's the same worry Descartes had: what if my whole experience is being manufactured and I have no way from inside that experience to tell? And that's the part of the brain in the vat scenario that refuses to go away no matter how cleverly you analyze the semantics. Whatever is true about whether the word vat successfully refers to anything, the phenomenology, the actual felt experience of being a brain fed a stream of manufactured signals, would be completely identical to the phenomenology of being an ordinary embodied person in an ordinary physical world. There is, by design, no experiment you could run from inside the vat that would reveal the vat, because every instrument you'd use, your eyes, your hands, your lab equipment, is itself just another set of manufactured signals arriving at the same brain. You cannot pinch yourself awake because the sensation of pinching, and the pain that follows, and the thought well that felt real are all part of the same simulated stream. The brain in a vat is, in a sense, Descartes' evil demon rebuilt out of electrodes and computer science instead of theology, and it carries exactly the same conclusion: certainty about the external world, real certainty, the kind that survives every possible challenge, is not something available to a mind reasoning from the inside of its own experience. There's a further wrinkle worth sitting with, one that separates the brain in a vat scenario from the merely fantastical and makes it uncomfortably close to certain real experiments already conducted in ordinary neuroscience labs. Researchers have long known that direct electrical or magnetic stimulation of specific regions of the brain can produce vivid, involuntary sensory experiences with no corresponding external stimulus at all: flashes of light, phantom smells, sensations of movement, even, in some documented neurosurgical cases, complex emotional states or a feeling of a presence in the room, triggered purely by a probe touching a particular patch of cortex. None of this proves the full brain in a vat scenario, which requires a coherent, continuously updated, full sensory stream rather than isolated flickers. But it demonstrates the underlying principle at a small scale, that the felt reality of an experience is generated entirely by neural activity, and that neural activity can, in principle, be triggered by something other than the correct external cause, while still producing a subjective experience indistinguishable from the inside from the real thing. The gap between a documented laboratory finding and the full thought experiment is one of degree and engineering, not one of basic principle. What makes the brain in a vat scenario worth taking seriously today, though, isn't really the vat and the electrodes. It's that it was the direct conceptual ancestor of an idea that has, in the last 2 decades, moved from philosophy seminar rooms into mainstream conversation discussed by physicists, technologists, and now essentially anyone with an internet connection. Because if you abate the thought experiment for an age of computers instead of an age of fats and wires, you arrive somewhere very specific. What if you're not a brain being fed signals by a machine, but a mind, or an entire universe being run as software inside a machine by someone else? This is simulation theory, and its most influential modern formulation comes from the philosopher Nick Bostrom, who published a paper in 2003 titled Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? Bostrom's argument is worth walking through carefully because it's often flattened in popular retellings into a simple claim that we're probably in a simulation, when the actual argument is more precise and more interesting than that. Bostrom starts from a few reasonable premises about the future of technology. First, he assumes that it's technically possible, in principle, for a sufficiently advanced civilization to run detailed simulations of conscious minds on computer hardware, simulations detailed enough that the simulated minds would be conscious and would experience their simulated world as fully real, the same way you experience the room you're sitting in right now. This isn't a wild assumption if you think computation is what actually produces consciousness rather than some special non-physical property of biological brains, because if a brain is, at bottom, a physical system processing information according to certain patterns, there's no obvious reason that pattern couldn't in principle be run on a different substrate, silicon instead of neurons, and produce the same experience. Given that assumption, Bostrom then presents what's known as the trilemma. He argues that at least one of the following three propositions must be true. Either 1. Almost all civilizations at our level of development go extinct before they ever reach the technological capability to run these kinds of detailed ancestor simulations. Or 2. Civilizations that do reach that level of capability overwhelmingly choose not to run large numbers of simulations of their own evolutionary history for whatever reason, ethical concerns, disinterest, resource constraints. Or 3. We are almost certainly living in a simulation right now. The logic behind the third option is a numbers game. If even one advanced civilization anywhere at any point decides to run many ancestor simulations, each containing billions of simulated conscious beings living through what feels to them like ordinary lives, then simulated minds would vastly outnumber the original, real minds that ever existed in base physical reality. And if simulated minds outnumber real ones by an enormous margin, then any given conscious observer, not knowing which category they belong to, would be statistically far more likely to be one of the simulated minds than one of the rare originals, purely as a matter of counting. Bostrom's point is not we are definitely in a simulation. His point is a kind of philosophical pincer. Given how things are set up, you're forced to accept at least one of the three propositions, and it's not obvious which one, and the third one, the one most people find most unsettling, can't simply be dismissed without some reason to believe one of the other two instead. This argument has attracted an enormous amount of attention, including from people well outside academic philosophy. Physicists have entered the conversation by asking whether the universe shows any signs of being computational at its foundations, whether space and time might be granular pixel-like rather than smooth in the way you'd expect if reality were being computed rather than continuous. So far, no decisive evidence either way has emerged, and there are serious physicists on multiple sides of the question, some pointing to features of quantum mechanics or the discreteness suggested by certain theories as at least consistent with a computational substrate, others arguing there's no real evidence for it at all and that the entire enterprise of looking for glitches in physics as proof of simulation is founded on a category error, mistaking mathematical description for underlying mechanism. It's worth being fair to the objections Bostrom's argument has attracted because they sharpen what's actually at stake rather than simply dismissing it. Some critics point out that the entire trilemma rests on an assumption that's far from obviously true, that consciousness is substrate independent, meaning it could in principle be produced by silicon-based computation just as well as by carbon-based neurons, provided the right kind of information processing is taking place. If consciousness instead depends on some specific physical or biological property that only certain kinds of matter possess, something current philosophy of mind cannot rule out, then no amount of computational power would ever produce a genuinely conscious simulated mind, only an extremely convincing behavioral imitation of one, and the entire numbers game Bostrom relies on would collapse because there would be no vast population of simulated conscious observers to outnumber the real ones in the first place. Other critics have raised a more practical objection, questioning whether the computational cost of simulating not just a single mind but an entire coherent, consistent universe around that mind down to a level of detail sufficient to withstand scientific investigation might be so astronomically large, even for a civilization with far greater resources than ours, that running many such simulations becomes implausible regardless of the underlying technology, undermining the premise that simulations, if possible at all, would be run in overwhelming numbers. And there's a more purely logical worry, sometimes called the simulation argument's self-undermining problem, which points out that if we are in a simulation, we have no good reason to trust that the physics we observe, the physics that led us to believe advanced computation of this kind is possible at all, bears any resemblance to the physics of whatever base reality is actually running the simulation. The very reasoning used to make simulations seem likely depends on assumptions about what technology can eventually do, assumptions drawn entirely from observations made inside the system whose reliability is precisely what's in question. None of these objections definitively refutes Bostrom's argument, but together they show that the trilemma is less a settled conclusion than an unusually rigorous way of making the ancient uncertainty legible in modern terms, dressed in probability and computer science rather than in demons or dressing gowns. But notice something important about simulation theory's actual philosophical status, something that tends to get lost when it's discussed as though it were a live scientific hypothesis rather than a modern retelling of a very old problem. Simulation theory isn't fundamentally a new argument. It's Descartes' evil demon and Putnam's brain in a vat, wearing the clothing of contemporary computer science. The demon becomes a programmer. The vat becomes a server. The electrical signals become rendered data, but the epistemological shape of the problem is unchanged because the entire premise of a good simulation is, by definition, that it would be indistinguishable from the inside. If you could tell you were in a simulation through some obvious glitch or seam, it would be a bad simulation, and the whole force of the thought experiment depends on imagining a simulation good enough that no internal test could reveal it. Which means, once again, we arrive at the same wall Descartes hit in 1641. There is no experiment available to a mind trapped entirely inside its own experience that can conclusively rule out the possibility that the experience is manufactured. Simulation theory dresses the ancient question in silicon and code, and in doing so makes it feel urgent and modern and scientific, but the actual philosophical content, the unanswerable core of it, has not moved an inch in nearly 400 years. What has moved, and this is worth pausing on, is something psychological rather than logical. It's the way each generation's version of this doubt borrows credibility from whatever that generation considers its most powerful and least understood technology. In an age of religious cosmology, the deceiver was a demon, because demons were the paradigm case of a hidden, powerful, malicious intelligence. In an age of early neuroscience and cybernetics, the deceiver became a scientist with electrodes and a vat because that was the cutting edge of manipulating experience directly. In an age of video games and machine learning, the deceiver becomes a programmer running a simulation on a server farm because that's now the most vivid image we have of a constructed, rule-governed, convincingly detailed alternate reality. The costume changes to match the technology each culture finds most awe-inspiring and least transparent. But strip the costume away and you find the same bare structure every time, a mind cut off from any outside verification, wondering whether what it experiences corresponds to anything beyond the experience itself. There's a particular twist worth noting in the simulation argument that Descartes and the brain in vat thinkers didn't quite have available to them, which is the recursive version. If a simulated civilization eventually develops its own advanced computing technology, there's no obvious reason it couldn't run simulations of its own nested inside the outer simulation, and those simulations could run further simulations nested inside them, and so on, in principle, for many layers. Some who take this argument seriously have pointed out that if simulations can nest this way, the ratio of simulated minds to base-level minds becomes even more extreme, because you're not just counting one layer of simulated observers against one layer of real ones, you're counting potentially many layers of simulated observers against a single ground floor. It's a strange kind of vertigo, imagining reality as something like nested dolls of experience, with no obvious way to know which doll you're inside, or whether the outermost doll even makes sense as a concept, whether there has to be a base reality at all, or whether the layers could, in some sense, go all the way down without any final, unsimulated ground beneath them. At this point you might reasonably start to feel that all of these thought experiments, the cave, the demon, the vat, the simulation, are essentially variations on the same trick, an elaborate philosophical hall of mirrors that never actually leads anywhere new. And that's a fair intuition, but it's worth turning to a thinker who took the underlying problem seriously in a completely different way, not by asking what if none of this is real, but by asking a quieter, in some ways more radical question. Even granting that something real is out there causing your experiences, is there any reason to think your mind delivers that reality to you as it actually is, rather than as your mind is built to represent it? This is the territory of Immanuel Kant, writing in Prussia in the late 18th century, in a dense and famously difficult book called The Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781. Kant's contribution to this whole tradition of doubt is subtle enough that it's often misunderstood, so it's worth being careful here. Kant is not a skeptic in the way Descartes' demon scenario is skeptical. Kant does not think the external world is an illusion, or that nothing exists outside your mind. In fact, Kant considered the total skepticism of thinkers who doubted the existence of an external world entirely to be, in his own words, a scandal to philosophy, something that needed to be answered decisively. What Kant argues instead is something more precise and, in its own way, more disorienting once you really sit with it. He draws a distinction between what he calls the noumenon, the thing as it is in itself, independent of any observer, and the phenomenon, the thing as it appears to a mind structured the way human minds happen to be structured. And his central claim is that human beings never have access to the noumenal world directly. We only ever encounter phenomena, appearances, because the mind isn't a passive mirror that simply reflects reality as it comes in. The mind is active. It imposes structure on raw sensory input before that input ever becomes a conscious experience at all. Kant argues, for instance, that space and time are not properties that exist out there in the world independent of any observer, waiting to be discovered the way you might discover a mountain range. Instead, he argues that space and time are what he calls forms of intuition, built-in structures of the human mind that organize raw sensation into a coherent spatial and temporal experience before we're even aware of doing any organizing. In other words, you don't perceive space and then place objects in it. Your mind is built in such a way that anything you perceive at all gets automatically arranged into a spatial and temporal framework, whether or not that framework corresponds to anything about the world as it exists independent of minds like yours. Alongside these forms of intuition, Kant proposes a set of categories of understanding, concepts like causality, unity, and substance, that the mind also imposes on raw experience in order to turn a chaotic flood of sensation into an organized, intelligible world of distinct objects that persists through time and act on one another in orderly, causal ways. It helps to have a concrete image for what Kant is claiming, because stated abstractly it can sound like a purely technical point. Imagine you're wearing a pair of glasses that you were born with, that you have never once taken off, that you cannot even conceive of taking off because you have no experience of unaided sight to compare it against. These glasses don't just tint the world a particular color, the way ordinary colored lenses would. They actively organize whatever light comes through them into shapes, sequences, and cause and effect relationships before any of it reaches your conscious awareness. You could spend a lifetime studying the world through these glasses, building extraordinarily precise sciences, discovering laws that let you predict eclipses to the second and build machines that fly, and every bit of that knowledge would be real, useful, and rigorously tested. But none of it would tell you what the world looks like without the glasses, because the glasses aren't optional equipment sitting between you and a view you could otherwise get directly. They are, on Kant's account, the very condition that makes having a view possible at all. Removing them wouldn't reveal the true world underneath. It would simply mean there was no view left to have. If Kant is right, and this is the vertiginous part, then the very features of the world that feel most basic and objective to you, that things happen in a sequence, that objects exist in three-dimensional space, that events have causes, might not be features of reality itself so much as features of the specific cognitive equipment you happen to have been born with. A being with differently structured cognition, Kant suggests, might organize raw experience using entirely different categories, and would therefore experience an entirely different world, not because the underlying reality is different, but because the mind doing the organizing works differently. The nominal world, the world as it actually is apart from any mind's contribution, remains permanently inaccessible, not because it's hidden behind a demon's trick or a simulation's rendering engine, but simply because the only way any mind can ever encounter anything is by processing it through its own particular structure, and that processing is not optional, not something you could switch off to get a clean look at what's really there. This is a genuinely different flavor of doubt than the ones that came before it, and it's worth being precise about why. Descartes' demon and the brain in that scenario both suggest that your experience might be a deliberate fabrication, that there might be no real tree outside the window at all, only a manufactured signal telling you there's a tree. Kant's picture is stranger than that, because Kant grants that there's a real world doing the causing, a nominal something that is genuinely out there, prompting your experience. What he denies is that your experience of that something, structured as it necessarily is by space, time, and causality, resembles the something in itself in any way you could verify. The tree outside your window might be entirely real in Kant's picture, and you might still never encounter the tree as it actually is, only the tree as filtered through the unavoidable architecture of a human mind perceiving it. It's not that reality is fake. It's that reality as it appears to you and reality as it actually is may simply be two different things, related but never identical, and the gap between them is not a bug that better instruments or sharper attention could close. It's a structural feature of what it means to be a mind perceiving anything at all. What's remarkable, looking back from where we now stand, is how much Kant's 240-year-old argument about the mind actively constructing experience rather than passively receiving it anticipates what contemporary neuroscience has independently discovered, working from a completely different direction, using tools Kant could never have imagined. For most of the 20th century, the common-sense picture of perception, even among many scientists, was roughly this: the world sends information inward, light hits the retina, sound waves hit the eardrum, and the brain passively assembles that incoming data into a picture, the way a photograph develops from exposed film. Perception, on this view, is basically a bottom-up process, starting with raw sensory data and building upward into conscious experience. Modern neuroscience, particularly research into what's called predictive processing, has substantially overturned that picture, and the overturning is one of the more genuinely startling developments in recent cognitive science. The predictive processing framework developed and refined by researchers including Carl Friston, Andy Clark, and others working in this space proposes that the brain is not primarily a passive receiver of sensory data at all. It's fundamentally a prediction engine. At every moment, your brain is generating a model, a best guess about what it expects to encounter next based on prior experience, context, and everything it already believes about the structure of the world, and it sends that prediction downward, so to speak, toward the incoming sensory streams. What actually reaches conscious awareness on this view is not raw sensory data climbing up from the eyes and ears into the brain. It's something closer to the brain's own prediction, continuously adjusted and corrected by whatever mismatch, whatever prediction error shows up between the model and the actual incoming signal. In other words, most of what you consciously experience as the world out there is generated from the inside by your brain's own predictive model, and the raw sensory data functions less like the picture itself and more like a correction signal, nudging the model when it drifts too far from what's actually happening. The neuroscientist Anil Seth, who has done extensive public work translating this research for general audiences, has described conscious perception memorably as a kind of controlled hallucination. The word hallucination sounds dramatic, almost like it's overselling the point, but the framing is precise rather than sensational. An uncontrolled hallucination, the kind associated with certain psychiatric conditions or altered states, is a perceptual experience generated by the brain's predictive machinery with little or no correction from actual sensory input, a model running free, disconnected from the world it's supposed to be tracking. Ordinary, everyday perception, on this account, is generated by the exact same predictive machinery, except that it's continuously, tightly constrained and corrected by real sensory data flowing in from the world. The difference between hallucinating and perceiving on this view isn't a difference in kind. It's a difference in how well the internally generated model stays tethered to external correction. You are, in a very real sense, hallucinating your experience of this sentence right now, constantly, and what makes it a reliable hallucination rather than a delusional one is that it's being continuously checked and adjusted against light actually hitting your retina. This has strange and very concrete implications once you start looking for them. Consider the phenomenon of the blind spot, the small region on your retina where the optic nerve exits the eye and where there are, quite literally, no photoreceptors at all, meaning there's a genuine gap in the visual information reaching your brain from each eye. You don't experience this gap as a black hole in your vision, a missing patch floating in your visual field, because your brain fills it in seamlessly, using its predictive model of what's probably there based on the surrounding visual context, and you have no subjective sense whatsoever that anything had been invented to paper over the whole. Or consider change blindness experiments in which researchers show subjects two nearly identical images or video frames with a substantial difference between them, a person's shirt changing color, an object disappearing entirely, and find that observers routinely fail to notice the change at all, sometimes even when directly staring at the altered region, because their brain's predictive model says nothing significant changed here and that prediction simply overrides the raw data unless the mismatch becomes large enough to force a correction. Your conscious visual experience is not a live, continuous feed of the actual state of the world. It's a best guess model, updated only when the discrepancy between guess and input crosses some threshold, and for most small changes, that threshold is never crossed and you walk around confidently certain you saw the whole scene when you actually saw a model of the scene with a great deal quietly filled in, smoothed over, or simply not updated. This same predictive logic extends well beyond vision into territory that touches something closer to your sense of self. Interoception, the sense by which the brain monitors internal bodily states, heart rate, temperature, hunger, tension in the muscles, operates on the same predictive principle, generating expectations about what's happening inside the body and adjusting emotional experience accordingly, rather than simply reading off a neutral internal gauge. Some researchers working in this area have argued that emotions themselves are best understood not as fixed hardwired reactions triggered directly by events in the world, distinct feelings waiting to be switched on like lights, but as the brain's best predictive guess about the meaning of a given pattern of bodily arousal, constructed in the moment, drawing on past experience and context rather than retrieved from some pre-labeled internal library. A racing heart in a dark alley gets modeled as fear. A racing heart at the top of a roller coaster, in a context signaling safety and fun, gets modeled as exhilaration. The raw bodily signal, in both cases, may be nearly identical. What differs is the model the brain builds around it, and that model, once built, is not experienced as an interpretation at all. It's experienced as simply how you feel, immediate and undeniable, exactly the way the color green is experienced as simply a property of the leaf rather than a construction assembled from wavelength data. If this research holds up, and it remains an active and contested area of study, it would mean that even the felt quality of your own inner life, the part of experience that seems most obviously, unquestionably yours, is itself a kind of controlled hallucination built the same way the visual world is built, correction and all. Color perception offers another striking case. Color, as you experience it, feels like a property that objects simply have, the way a leaf just is green, sitting there on the tree, radiating its greenness independent of any observer. But physically, what's actually happening is that surfaces reflect certain wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation more than others, and your visual system, specifically 3 types of cone cells in the retina tuned to roughly different, overlapping ranges of wavelength, converts that reflected light into neural signals that your brain then interprets and constructs into the subjective experience of color. Wavelength itself has no color. It's a physical property, a measurement of the distance between peaks in an electromagnetic wave. Color, the actual felt quality of greenness or redness, exists only in the constructive act of a visual system built a certain way, processing that wavelength information. Change the visual system, and the color disappears or transforms. Many other animals see wavelengths of light entirely invisible to human eyes, ultraviolet patterns on flowers, for instance, that guide pollinating insects toward nectar, patterns human beings walk past every day without any hint that they are there. The flower isn't hiding anything. Your visual system simply isn't built to render it. What you call the way the world looks is a rendering produced by equipment evolution built for the specific job of helping a particular kind of primate survive and reproduce, not a job description that includes delivering an unfiltered transcript of physical reality. There's a related line of research, sometimes discussed under the heading of the interface theory of perception, developed by the cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman, that pushes this idea about as far as it can currently go. Hoffman's argument, built using evolutionary game theory rather than direct neuroscience, is that natural selection does not favor organisms whose perceptual systems accurately represent the true structure of reality. It favors organisms whose perceptual systems keep them alive and help them reproduce, and Hoffman argues through a series of simulations pitting truth-tracking perceptual strategies against fitness-tracking ones across generations of evolving digital agents, that accurate perception is consistently and decisively outcompeted by useful perception whenever the two come apart. His preferred analogy is the desktop interface of a computer. The icon for a document on your screen is blue, rectangular, and sits in a particular location, and none of those properties bear any direct resemblance to the actual arrangement of transistors, voltages, and magnetic states inside the machine that the icon represents. The interface isn't lying to you exactly. It's hiding a staggering amount of true complexity behind a simplified, actionable symbol, because you don't need to know about the voltages to drag the file into a folder, and knowing about the voltages would in fact slow you down and make the interface far less usable. Hoffman's provocative suggestion is that your entire perceptual experience, space-time, physical objects might function the same way, not as a transparent window onto reality's actual structure, but as a species-specific interface shaped by millions of years of selection pressure toward usefulness rather than truth. This is a genuinely controversial position within cognitive science, and plenty of researchers push back hard on it, arguing that Hoffman's models smuggle in assumptions that guarantee his conclusion, and that there are good evolutionary reasons to expect at least some perceptual accuracy to be selected for, since wildly inaccurate perception would seem to carry its own steep survival costs. But even critics of Hoffman's strongest claims generally accept the more modest version of his point, the one shared with Kant and with the predictive processing framework more broadly. Perception was never built for accuracy as its primary goal. It was built for usefulness and accuracy, while often correlated, are not the same thing and can come apart in ways a perceiving creature would have no way of detecting from the inside. Kant, again, working purely through careful introspective reasoning nearly 2.5 centuries before any of this neuroscience existed, arrived at strikingly similar territory. The world as consciously experienced is a construction, actively assembled by the mind's own structure, not a transparent window onto things as they exist independent of any observer. What neuroscience adds isn't a philosophical refutation of Kant so much as a mechanistic, empirically grounded account of how, specifically, that construction happens moment to moment inside a physical brain, through predictive modeling and error correction. It doesn't resolve the deeper metaphysical question Kant was asking about whether the noumenal world can ever be known. But it does something almost more unsettling, in a way, by making the constructed nature of ordinary experience concrete, testable, and demonstrable in a laboratory, rather than something you have to take on philosophical faith. You can watch it happen. You can trigger the blind spot yourself, right now, with a printed dot and a piece of paper, and watch your own brain paper over a hole in your vision without so much as a flicker of subjective doubt. Before pulling these threads together, it's worth asking directly why certainty seems to be structurally, rather than just practically, out of reach, because there's a piece of the puzzle we haven't named yet, one that shows up not in any single thought experiment but in the very shape of what it means to justify a belief at all. Ancient skeptics, particularly a thinker named Agrippa, whose work survives mostly through later summaries by writers like Sextus Empiricus, identified a problem with the entire project of justification that applies regardless of whether you're worried about caves, demons, vats, or simulations. Suppose you believe something, and someone asks you to justify it. You offer a reason, but now the reason itself is a belief. And it too can be questioned, and so it needs its own justification, and so on. At this point, Agrippa's argument goes, there are only ever 3 ways this chain can end, and none of them delivers the kind of certainty we're looking for. The chain could go on forever, one justification requiring another without end, which means it never actually completes and so never actually grounds anything. Or the chain could become circular, with some earlier belief eventually being used to justify a later belief that was itself used several steps back to justify that earlier one, which is really just disguised assertion, not genuine support. Or the chain could simply stop at some belief that is asserted without further justification, treated as basic or self-evident, which is exactly the kind of unproven starting point that a demanding skeptic was questioning in the first place. This is sometimes called the regress problem, and it's not a cute philosophical puzzle so much as a genuine structural fact about what justification is and how it works. Every belief you hold, including the belief that your senses are reliable, that your reasoning is sound, that memory tracks the past accurately, either terminates in something accepted without further proof, loops back on itself, or trails off into an infinite chain that never actually finishes the job. Descartes thought he had found an escape hatch in the cogito, a belief so basic it didn't need any further justification because doubting it proved it. But notice that everything Descartes tried to build on top of that single foundation, the existence of a good, non-deceiving God, the reliability of clear and distinct perception, the reality of the external world, still had to run the same gauntlet, and most philosophers who have studied his later arguments closely have found them far less secure than the cogito itself, often accusing him of arguing in a circle, using the reliability of clear and distinct ideas to prove God's existence, and then using God's existence to guarantee the reliability of clear and distinct ideas. This is not a failure unique to Descartes. It's what happens to essentially every serious attempt to build certain knowledge from the ground up once you push hard enough on the foundations. Somewhere, the chain either loops, stops, or runs forever, and none of the three options gives you the unshakable bedrock you originally went looking for. This is why the cave, the demon, the vat, and the simulation aren't really four separate problems that happen to resemble each other. They are four different entry points into the same underlying structural fact that justification has to start somewhere, that the starting point can't justify itself without circularity, and that any mind trying to verify its own foundational trust in its senses and its reasoning is by definition using those same senses and that same reasoning to run the check. There is no Archimedean point, no place to stand outside the system to get leverage on it, because a mind is not a tool that operates on reality from a safe distance. A mind is itself part of whatever reality it's trying to investigate, embedded in it, built out of it, dependent on it for the very apparatus doing the investigating. So where does all of this leave us? We've walked from a cave of shadows, through a demon's total deception, into a vat of electrified nuance, out into a simulated universe run on some incomprehensibly advanced hardware, and then, in a different direction entirely, into the quiet structural argument that even a real and present world can never be encountered except through the particular architecture of the mind perceiving it, an architecture modern neuroscience shows to be constantly guessing, constantly filling gaps, constantly prioritizing useful prediction over raw fidelity to whatever is actually out there. Each of these routes, approached from wildly different centuries, disciplines, and starting assumptions, arrives at something like the same conclusion, and it's worth stating that conclusion plainly rather than dressing it up. Certainty, the kind of total, unassailable certainty that would let you say with absolute confidence this is exactly how reality is, and I could not possibly be wrong, appears to be permanently unavailable to a mind using nothing but its own faculties to investigate itself and its situation. Not because you haven't looked hard enough, or thought carefully enough, or gathered enough evidence, but because every tool you would use to check your senses, your reasoning, your instruments, your very ability to notice a discrepancy is itself part of the system under investigation. You cannot get outside your own perspective to verify your perspective from a neutral vantage point, because outside your perspective isn't a place a perceiving, thinking being can actually stand. This is not a temporary limitation waiting on better science or sharper philosophy to fix it. It looks, the more carefully you examine it, like a structural feature of what it means to be a finite, embedded mind trying to know anything at all, including itself. It would be easy to end there, on that note of vertigo, the same vertigo Descartes described feeling in his whirlpool, unable to touch bottom or swim to the surface. And it's worth sitting in that discomfort for a moment rather than rushing past it, because the discomfort is doing real work. It's dissolving a kind of unearned confidence that most of us walk around with most of the time, the assumption that what we perceive simply is the world, full stop, no asterisk required. That confidence is comfortable, but comfort was never a reliable guide to truth, and Plato's prisoners were comfortable too, comfortable enough to want to kill anyone who tried to drag them towards something less certain but more real. But there's a difference worth drawing out between two questions that sound similar and are actually completely different. The first question is, can I achieve total, unrevisable certainty about the ultimate nature of reality? The honest answer, after everything we've walked through, appears to be no, and probably never. The second question is entirely separate. Given that total certainty is unavailable, is there still a meaningful difference between better and worse ways of engaging with whatever reality actually is? And here the answer changes completely, because it turns out you don't need metaphysical certainty to make that distinction. You need something much more modest and much more available: coherence, consistency, and predictive power. Even Descartes, in the depths of his most extreme doubt, found something that survived the bare fact of a thinking, doubting subject. Even a simulated mind, if Bostrom's argument is taken seriously, still experiences joy, pain, love, and loss as fully real from the inside, whatever the underlying substrate turns out to be, because the argument was never that simulated experience would feel fake or diminished, only that it might be running on different hardware than we assumed. Even Kant, denying that the noumenal world could ever be directly known, spent the rest of his philosophical career building a rigorous account of how phenomenal experience, the world as it appears, could still be investigated systematically, still support real science, still ground real ethical obligations between people who share that phenomenal world together. And even predictive processing, for all its talk of controlled hallucination, describes a hallucination that is controlled, constrained, disciplined by an ongoing, unrelenting correction from something outside the model, something the model has to answer to whether it wants to or not. That word, control, might be the most important word in this entire story, because it points toward the actual, livable answer to a question that has no theoretical resolution. You may never be able to prove in some final, demon-proof, simulation-proof sense that the tree outside your window is exactly what it appears to be, made of exactly the atoms your physics textbooks describe, existing independently of any mind's contribution to how it looks and feels. But you can notice that the tree behaves consistently. It's there tomorrow. Other people, using their own separately constructed, separately fallible perceptual systems, report encountering something remarkably similar in that same location. You can lean on it, time it, watch it lose its leaves on a predictable schedule, and photosynthesize in ways that can be measured, modeled, and used to correctly predict its future behavior. None of that constitutes metaphysical proof. But it constitutes something that has quietly, functionally mattered to human beings for the entire span of our existence, long before anyone had the vocabulary to worry about caves or demons or simulations, a reality robust enough to build a life inside of, whether or not it is, in some final sense, the only reality there is. This is, in the end, why the story keeps getting retold instead of settled. Every generation encounters some version of this vertigo, usually alone, usually late at night, usually triggered by something as small as staring too long at your own hand and suddenly finding it strange, and every generation reaches, more or less, for the same two moves. First, the honest admission that the ground is not as solid as it feels, that certainty was always a kind of borrowed confidence rather than an earned one. And second, the quieter, more practical recovery that follows, the recognition that a life doesn't actually require metaphysical certainty to be worth living well, only enough coherence, enough consistency, enough shared, correctable experience with the people around you to build something real inside of whatever real ultimately turns out to mean. Plato's freed prisoner, remember, never got a guarantee. Even at the top of that painful climb, staring finally at the sun, there was no cosmic voice confirming that this, at last, was the unmediated truth, no way to be absolutely sure there wasn't some further cave containing this one, some further layer above the sunlight the prisoner had fought so hard to reach. What the prisoner got instead was simply a better vantage point, a wider field of view, a diminished but not eliminated distance between appearance and whatever lies beneath it. And crucially, Plato has that prisoner choose to go back down, back into the dark, back among the people still watching shadows, not because the truth had become fully certain and safe to deliver, but because it seemed worth trying to share anyway, even at the risk of being misunderstood, even at the risk of stumbling in the dim light on the way back in. Maybe that's the only honest place to leave this. Not with an answer, because there isn't one waiting at the bottom of any of these thought experiments, not the cave, not the demon, not the vat, not the simulation, not even Kant's careful architecture of the mind, but with a kind of orientation. You are a mind built by processes you didn't choose, using equipment you didn't design, trying to make sense of something vastly larger than the equipment can fully capture. That was always true, whether or not you're a brain in a vat, whether or not this is a simulation, whether or not the tree outside your window is exactly as it appears. The uncertainty was never really about whether reality is fake. It was about how much of reality any single, finite mind could ever hope to hold. And the answer to that question, quietly, has been available the whole time, in every version of the story. Not everything, but enough to keep climbing anyway. There's one more thing worth noticing, something that ties every figure in this story together in a way that's easy to miss if you only focus on the doubt they each raised. Plato didn't stop at describing the cave. He spent the rest of his philosophical life building an account of justice, education, and the good life on the assumption that some things really were better and truer than others, even without absolute proof available to settle every disagreement. Descartes didn't stay in the whirlpool. He got up the next morning, kept working, and eventually became one of the founders of modern physics and analytic geometry, fields that require an enormous amount of practical confidence in the reliability of reasoning and observation deployed by a man who had, on paper, demonstrated that reliability could never be fully proven. Kant, having concluded that the noumenal world would remain forever beyond direct access, did not retreat into silence. He wrote entire systems of ethics and political philosophy built on the world as it appears to rational beings who shared that appearance in common, treating the phenomenal world as more than solid enough to found real obligations between real people. Even Bostrom, having laid out an argument that leaves open the live possibility that none of this is base-level reality, has spent much of his career doing exactly what you'd do if you took the physical world and its future extremely seriously, researching risks to human civilization, writing about how to protect the long-term trajectory of a species he has also argued might be a simulation. None of these thinkers treated the impossibility of total certainty as a reason to stop reasoning, stop building, stop caring about getting things right within whatever reality they found themselves inside. They treated it as the actual starting condition of a thinking creature, the ground floor rather than a problem to be solved before real living could begin. That pattern is probably the most practical thing to take from all of this, more practical, in the end, than any of the individual thought experiments. Uncertainty about the deepest nature of reality turns out to be compatible with an enormous amount of confidence about smaller, nearer things. You can be unable to prove, in any final sense, that the external world exists exactly as it appears, and still be entirely justified in trusting that the floor will hold your weight tomorrow morning, because that trust isn't resting on metaphysical certainty, it's resting on an unbroken, testable, shared pattern of experience that has never once failed you, and that other minds built differently than yours independently confirm. You can accept that your perception is a construction, a controlled hallucination, an interface rather than a window, and still use that very perception to build bridges that don't collapse, medicines that work, telescopes that let you see light that left its source billions of years before there was anyone around to receive it. The tools might be interfaces rather than direct windows, but interfaces can still be extraordinarily reliable, precisely because they were shaped, whether by evolution or by careful scientific correction, against a real and pushing back world that keeps rewarding accurate enough models and punishing badly wrong ones. Maybe that's the real difference between Plato's chained prisoners and the one who got dragged into the light. It was never that the freed prisoner achieved some final, unrevisable grasp of the truth. It's that the freed prisoner kept testing the model against a wider and wider range of experience, kept letting the sunlight correct what the shadows had gotten wrong, kept accepting the discomfort of revision instead of clinging to the comfort of the wall. The chains were never really iron. They were confidence in an unexamined picture, confidence so total it didn't feel like confidence at all, it felt like just seeing what's there. And the walk out of the cave was never a walk toward certainty. It was walk toward a wider, harder one, still incomplete kind of seeing, the only kind available to a mind that has to live and act and care about things long before it could ever hope to settle the question of what reality ultimately is. So the next time you catch yourself staring at your own hand a little too long, or lying awake wondering whether the room around you is quite as solid as it feels, you don't have to chase that feeling all the way down to an answer, because there isn't one waiting there. You can let the vertigo do its actual job instead, which was never to strand you, only to loosen a grip you didn't know you were holding, and then you can get up, walk back into the world you've got, and keep building something real inside of it, one correction, one shared observation, one hard-won inch of daylight at a time.